this is episode 121 in the series where normally I'm programming an NES game from scratch, sometimes live. And tonight we have a special guest, Jonathon, or Wiggy, from Oleschool Gamers.
Hey guys.
And he and I started chatting about NES programming because he has started working on his own game. And we thought it would be kind of cool to do a stream where he and I chat and we talk about NES programming and getting started and his experiences sort of from the beginning instead of the opposite, where we had Kevin and Bo and Derek and Nathan talking about what it's like to make a bunch of games. So someone more like where I'm coming from, where I have some programming experience, and then decided I wanted to make an NES game, so kind of share that side of things. So welcome, and thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here, and definitely am coming at this with a brand new beginning, wet behind the ears kind of feel. So I'm very interested to see your side of things and learn as much as I can. So
cool.
Really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, of course. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started doing this?
Sure. So on my channel, we do a lot of retro gaming with reviews and just fun live streams. I do tournaments, and it's every guy's and gals, the gamer's dream to be able to make a Nintendo game. And it was on my bucket list. Decided to do it, and doing some research, I came across a lot of different forums, and your videos, actually, the 0-page videos, that's what pushed me over the edge. And I said, you know what, I can do this. So I kind of dove right in based on what I saw. So I'm a Perl and C# programmer by trade, Unix admin too. So I have a little bit of a shell and bash background, but assembly, no, never done it. It's completely different. It's overwhelming me. It's not so much overwhelming. I mean, once you know the opcodes, you're good. But just understanding the architecture of the NES, how it works, and what you need to do to get something on the screen has been kind of a hurdle. And we can go more into that. But so I've dove right in. I've got a couple hundred lines of a basic program of my game, and I'm about a month and a half in. So that's where I'm at.
Cool. Yeah. So we were talking a little bit before. You have your own YouTube channel, and you were talking about how meticulously you work to put them together and edit them, at least within reason. But this is no surprise to anybody who's watched the videos. I was joking that my secret is to never edit anything, and then that also helps with being able to put the videos on multiple platforms. I don't actually keep the recordings on Twitch. I do the live stream on Twitch, and then I take the recording. I record on my local machine, and then I take the recording and I post that on YouTube. So yeah, simple, quick. Except for the 0 pages, which is what consumes most of my editing time and patience. So,
and just so happened to be the videos that pushed me over the edge. So,
well, and I realized after going through and making a whole lot of the longer videos that people were asking questions about things that were covered in the videos, maybe later on or not at all. And I was thinking, well, I could tell them to refer to this part of the timeline and spend a lot of time finding it myself, or put together a really short set of videos that condense everything that's in the longer set, and then say, okay, so if you want to learn how to do sprites, here you go. If you want to learn what hexes and why we're using assembly, then go watch this one. And I think the longest one is 40 minutes, and even that was way longer than I wanted it to be. I was hoping that they'd all be no longer than about 10 minutes. But
So,
that one about hex and assembly especially was that was hard to condense down quickly, because there's just so much that you have to get through to get to the point where you can actually start writing your first line of code.
yeah, I've noticed that too, and I'm sure you're aware of the Nerdy Nights tutorials, which have been infamously known throughout the community. And it was good and bad in the sense that I was eager, as a lot of programmers are, to jump into Nintendo programming. You see Zelda and Contra, and you immediately want to come out with your version of Part 2 and, just jump right in and make a big game. And reading through the Nerdy Nights, and some of the information became a little bit monotonous, and I was kind of getting frustrated to where I just wanted to get to the code. And so having the patience to really learn the architecture is something that I've had to kind of step back and just slow down and appreciate. So
Yeah, and that's the challenge with these older game consoles, is you can't skip that part. And I had the good fortune to have some experience with that, so I kind of knew that was going to be the case. Getting into it, I had programmed a little bit for the Game Boy Advance, which is not quite as low level as the NES. It's actually a much easier and nicer machine to program for, but it's also, because it's so much more advanced, the games then are more demanding to create from an art and music perspective. So I was thinking, since I'm doing this by myself, I want to go with the NES. It's straightforward, and it'll make it that much easier to get something done in a reasonable amount of time. So I was used to saying, okay, if I want to draw a sprite, that's part of the hardware, and so you have to know how to talk to the hardware to make that happen. But that's not normally how you write code. I mean, even gaming libraries, like I don't know, did you ever play around with XNA in C#?
So I did come across XNA when I first started just thinking of programming games in general. I did come across XNA. It did seem to be a very interesting framework with libraries built in for C#, and there's a couple of Visual Studio, not applet. What's the word I'm looking for? Class, I think, that you could download and import, where all you had to do is just then access the methods and call whatever function you're trying to do. And it entertained me for a little bit, but I have a heart for retro, and I kind of dropped it, and started doing some research into other game programming, and of course came across RPG and Game Maker, and some of the Unity, Click Fusion, things like that. And none of it really satisfied. It's like, what, I got to dive in and find out how to make a game for Nintendo. And that was about a year ago, and started doing that this year. So
yeah. So XNA is really nice, though. It's actually one of the better libraries that I've messed around with for game programming. And that was something we had worked on. A friend of mine and I had worked on a game in C# that used that, and even paid the fee that you could at the time to be able to run it on the Xbox 360, because it used to allow you to do that. Yeah, so we were able to test it on the Xbox 360, and that sort of, there's something really cool about running your game on proprietary hardware like an Xbox or an NES.
Very true, very true. I had the Xbox 360, and XNA is actually that's how I found it. I was looking for how to program games for the Xbox 360, and XNA was one of the hits that kept popping up on Google. So I decided to read up on it and find out what it was all about. So
yeah. So when you were talking about the Nerdy Nights kind of not moving at a pace that you felt satisfying, I don't even know if that's the right word, but can you describe to me, like, what was the challenge there for you to get through those tutorials? Was
Sure.
it just the pacing, or the density of the content, or what was it?
It was a little bit of that and a little bit of my own, well, I'll just say it, arrogance. I looked at the first week, and it was talking about, like system cores and hex and decimal, and I understand that that's absolutely necessary. It is. But in my mind, I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to have to wait till week? How many weeks are there? Week 10 before I actually get to seeing code. I'm a C# programmer. I'm a Bash programmer. I'm a Perl what? Give me the code. I just want to see what the code is.
Right.
And in hindsight, that was extremely fallible. That was the wrong way to go. Yeah, I've had to go back and read, weeks 1 through 5 several times just to get some of the basics, because when you're programming, like for example, XNA or any C# game development, you kind of touched on it when you talked about the Game Advance or Game Boy Advance development, and how much simpler it is when you just reference a bitmap, or you reference several bitmaps for frames, for animation. Well, looking at it from an NES perspective, you're not referencing a bitmap and you're not loading that into the memory of the video card. You're literally painting it sprite by sprite, tile by tile, address by address, and you have to know those addresses. And I didn't realize how meticulous and how old school the NES hardware really was. And so I had to really learn to appreciate it. And so I did. I went back through the binary. I understood binary anyway, but it took me a little bit to refresh, and that really helped. Understanding that, 1 byte, may have a simple numeric value, but there may be instances, especially when you're dealing with attributes of sprites, that each bit in that byte may have a specific, on-off necessity that you may not be aware of. And so I didn't understand at first why they were even going over binary. So that would be an example of, oh, okay, well, they're covering binary because you may need it. And you can't just code, $00 for your value. You may need, a few of those bits turned on, and it's just easier for me to visualize that in binary than it is in decimal or hex.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting thing that you brought up, is that that mindset for older hardware where things are encoded in bits. I mean, you don't do that in modern code. People would fire you, I think, no matter.
What are you doing?
Yeah, unless you have a specific performance reason that you can use to justify it, where there's some sort of customer contract at stake or something. But like, I remember at my previous job, I was arguing with one of the other programmers. I said, well, just encode it in a bit field, because we don't need this to be, we don't need single bytes to represent that. That's wasteful. And he's like, who's going to understand that besides you and me?
Good point.
Yeah, and in my arrogance at the time, I still kind of disagreed with him, but he was right, because modern programming, and this is one of those things where I wonder if the pendulum will swing the other way. Modern programming is all about getting code churned out as quickly as possible, and at some point it's like, well, we can't make the CPUs any faster. We can put more cores in the CPUs, but we can't make them any faster. We can't make the drives any faster. We can't make the RAM any faster. So now, sorry guys, you got to start writing better code.
Very true.
But we'll see. We'll see if that actually happens.
I fully believe, based on to go on what you were saying, I fully believe that systems like PS2 and above, as far as systems that are less retro, I fully believe that they were, systems that were underdeveloped, I guess is the best way to put it, where the potential was never fully executed because some of the games were churned out quicker and quicker, and there were timelines, and they weren't able to really fully. For example, if I'm going to put out a Memory Mapper Zero game, which I can actually talk about now because I know memory mappers. But if I'm going to put out a Memory Mapper Zero game and only use 200 out of the 256 tiles for sprites, because the deadline was tomorrow and I just had to get it out, by putting a little bit more content, a little bit more animation of the frames, etc. Just as an example, I fully believe that there are a lot of systems that were just underdeveloped and games were just pushed out. They didn't reach their full potential.
Yeah, I mean, I know that. I don't think it was the PlayStation 2. I think it was the PlayStation 3. That hardware was also notoriously difficult to program for.
Mm-hmm.
And the N64 had a similar problem, that beyond just the basics of rendering 3D graphics, you had to really understand the hardware at a very low level in order to get anything that performed well, because of how specialized the hardware was. I'm pretty sure that's right, because the PS3 had the Emotion engine with the cell processor in it, and the N64 was just this really complex thing that included that specialized hardware from Silicon Graphics, right? So I think that's a challenge. I think that's why there's also this focus with modern systems like the PS4 and the Xbox One to be more PC-like now, is because there are so many people that understand how to program for that. And so if your platform supports something that's PC-like, they can not only get their games done quicker, but the performance should be reasonable because they have the same kinds of optimizations on the PS4 as on the Xbox One, as on the standard PC running Windows. To some extent, I mean, they all have their own CPU architecture and graphics architecture. So, to some extent, that's not true. But just generally, it's not like with the NES, where you literally have to know not only how the 6502 works, but also how the PPU works. Because if you don't know how to do anything with the PPU, you're not getting graphics on the screen.
Nope, absolutely true. When I was looking at your zero-page videos, I got to tell you, Michael, when you were when I was looking at the zero page, the whiteboard clicked everything. When I saw you draw it, lay it out, and actually put, the PPU and the CPU here, and you started actually drawing it and describing where VBlink was, that kind of simplistic yet necessary description was going back to the Nerdy Nights. While I appreciate, Bunny Boy who posted that, there were some simplistic things that were just missing that made it frustrating because I'm a visual learner. And so when I was going through them, I understood I needed to know it, but I didn't know why or where it applied. And they had some visuals and they do have some pictures, but seeing it actually drawn out and explained at the same time is a little bit different than just reading a post. So that really helped.
Cool. Yes, people seem to really like that one, that episode 1 of the series where I outlined the whole architecture. And I guess I didn't really think about why that was different or good or bad. It was just, to me, it's like, if you're going to get started, you have to understand how this all kind of fits together. So I'm glad to hear that was helpful for you.
I think I've given you 12 views on that video alone.
Oh,
I've watched it probably 10 times.
Well, that one is not only, I think, by virtue of being my first real video on this, I think that one is also the most viewed, and not only the most viewed, but the longest viewed. Here, let's check where we're up to, because I haven't looked at it in a while.
Several thousand. I don't remember the count, but
Yeah,
several thousand.
it's pretty surprisingly
Popular.
yeah, my computer is struggling under streaming and Google Hangouts here. Come on. But so while I look that up, why don't you so what's been the most challenging? You've talked a little bit about it, but what's been the most challenging part of learning the NES for you?
So not just getting into the assembly language itself, of course, has its own ups and downs, and you have to know the NES architecture. We've kind of discussed that. Uh, for me, there wasn't a lot of discussion, and I had to do a lot of research and a lot of oops and uh-ohs and how come this doesn't work and what does this mean. As far as I'd like to talk a little bit about the assembly format itself. NESDev had a couple articles, and a few people have touched on it on the forums, but general, like your video really helped. For example, the INES header and the different formats. What are banks? What are orgs? What is a .db? What's a .dw? What is .rs? Like a lot of those took me, and I'm still learning, a lot of, I guess, pause and just rereading and relearning and rereading and relearning until it finally sinks in. It's just very hard to wrap my head around the assembly format itself, that I'm coding everything that's supposed to fit on a PRG chip, okay, or ROM chip. And in that ROM chip, how much memory do I have? And how much space, can I use for my actual code? And so I'm starting to now look at efficiencies or deficiencies in my code to see how I can actually save a line of code if I do, just decrementing X vice, throwing it into the accumulator and doing this and that and the other. So a lot of just the assembly format itself was the initial hurdle, and is still, I still don't have a full grasp of banks and orgs. I can talk about them, but not in an intelligent enough way to describe. For example, I see code that starts at E0000, and I see other people's examples of code that starts at C, or I think it's 8000, or is it C00? Anyway,
Both.
there's both, right? And I don't understand. I don't understand the reason, or just banks in general. They kind of confuse. And I'm not talking about bank switching and memory mapping, just simple one memory mapper, zero set of banks kind of organization in the assembly code.
Right. So and I mean, it is memory mapping, right? The memory mapping is what determines where that code starts. And the sort of weird thing, and I don't know if this was something that was done, I don't know if it was done this way I don't know if this was done this way for NES games back when they were being made regularly commercially, or if this is something that is just as a result of the way that things were developed for homebrew people programming, sort of more hobbyist. And I think it's probably the same way it was done commercially. And we got a question here, and Gao on the chat here, who's Nathan Tolbert, he was saying it doesn't help that every assembler does it differently.
Oh, he beat me to my next question, which is what assembler do I use? Go for banks first, and then I'll talk about assemblers.
So basically, I mean, the way I envision it is that the code you're writing is a description of the layout of the ROM chips on the board.
That's an interesting way to, I've never thought of it like that, and I like that analogy. A description of how. Say it again. That's a good one. I like that.
A description of how the code, how the ROM chips are on the board. So when you're writing your assembly and you're saying, okay, barring the header, because the header is only useful for emulators, to my knowledge, and things like the EverDrive or the Power Pack, who need to know what kind of hardware they're simulating or emulating. You're writing your assembler file in a way that organizes the code as if each section is a different chip. So you're the way that it's done in NESASM is the .org, right? Which you give it an address, and the reason you give it that specific address is because on a board running mapper 0, when it gets connected to the CPU, it's memory mapped to that address in memory. So you have to make sure that you have the same corresponding address in your code, or all of your offsets for your address, like your jumps and branches, are all going to be wrong.
Gotcha. Okay. That actually really helps. Okay. Yeah, I think what kind of threw me off, mostly because I didn't see a difference. Let me see if I can word this properly. Basically, I thought orgs and banks were synonymous, mostly because every example of code, I would see bank and then an org declaration right after each other. So I kind of thought to myself, well, if I'm declaring a new bank and I also have to declare a new org, why do I have to do that separately if they seem to be requiring, or at least required by one another, or at least sequential, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. I have to think about it because it's been a while since I've used NESASM, but I believe that it's because NESASM defines banks explicitly with the requirement of you to then give the organization the address after it.
That is how mine's set up. It's bank and then organization right after.
Now you can use multiple orgs within a bank because you might want to, for whatever reason, have some of your code start in one spot and then have more of your code start in another spot. There are specific reasons that you would do that for something like the vectors, right? The reset, NMI, and interrupt vectors. You have to tell the assembler that you need those to show up at the end of the memory map, because you need it to be in those specific addresses so that when the CPU starts up, it can find them.
You actually beat me to it. I went to look at my code and I did see a second org in bank number 1, and it was for the vectors. So yeah, that's a good one.
So I mean, in CC65, going back to the chat here, in CC65, you don't explicitly define banks. You organize segments based on your address, the starting address and the size of the address, and then whether it's read-only or read-write. Because you can define segments as RAM or ROM, so that you can organize the RAM and ROM in a similar way, which to me is a little bit more straightforward, because having that separate bank declaration is, like you were saying, kind of redundant in some way.
Right.
So again, not to repeat myself, but the thing is, I still think of it as like, okay, if I'm declaring a segment, or if I'm putting an org in the line, I'm with that bank directive before it, that's one ROM chip, and the banks themselves for switching, it further complicates things when you do something that allows for bank switching, because then your code, you have multiple segments of code that appear in the same address space and will have the same starting memory address, but are separated out into multiple segments because only one of them can be loaded at a time. And then you tell the mapper, hey, switch to this bank, which loads the code into the same location in memory. It's kind of analogous to using like a dynamic library, right? It's way less flexible, but basically you're saying, hey, I've got this code that I need to run. It's over here. So switch that into memory so I can run it. And it does. The difference, though, is that, you're so limited in memory, you can't have them all at once. You've got to be swapping back and forth to make them accessible. And then Nathan was saying that CC65 is more complicated in regard, but it's a lot more clear about what's going on once you understand it. And I agree. I think it's as far as you were saying, what assembler to use. I mean,
you're probably going to give me the answer everyone else has, which it depends, and it's a personal choice. But that doesn't really help. But it seems to be the common thread.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're someone who is comfortable as a programmer doing work in code every day, I think CC65 is actually the better option, personally.
Okay.
But that's my biased opinion. I found that NESasm is good for getting started because it's super straightforward. But there were a number of little things that I encountered while programming with it that I didn't like, including a bug where if your column is, if you have I think it's like more than 64 characters in your column, it will still assemble. It will not work. But you wouldn't know that unless you knew someone who knew that bug existed, or found it randomly somewhere in the forums or something. So as long as you remember that you can't go past 64 I don't think it's bytes, maybe it's characters, something like that. There's some limitation of how far you can go with your code on NESasm. And as long as you remember that, it's fine. And some people swear by that. Bunny Boy and Kevin and Bo all still use it, and obviously put games out and code out no problem.
Okay. I didn't realize that there was a that limitation. When you speak of columns, do you mean the length on any particular line in my assembly code, or?
Yeah, I believe that's what the limitation is.
Okay.
It may not be. It may be that if you're defining bytes in the assembler, like using the what is it? Is it .db in NESasm?
Yes, .db.
Yeah, it might be that if you do that and you have more than 64 bytes, then it ignores anything after the 64th byte, but doesn't throw an error that it ignored it, which is important when that's maybe your level data or your something that you're using in your game, which hopefully you wouldn't be just throwing junk in there. So generally it results in weird bugs that take forever to find until someone's like, oh, you should check to make sure you don't have too many bytes in your byte definition directives.
Do you happen to remember, just to dive into that a little bit more, do you happen to remember the I guess delimiter? Is it 64 bytes between each .db declaration, or?
Yes.
Okay. So
yeah, so you could do 64, 64, 64, and as long as you didn't do more than that, it wouldn't be a problem. But again, you have to know that. And for whatever I was doing, I think
you did like a whole background or something.
Yeah, something, and it was more than that, and it was not behaving consistently, and I was confused, and then I posted in the Discord, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you got to remember that that you can't use more than that many bytes. And then I started looking at CC65 and I was like, you know what? I like this better. So I switched.
Yeah, I've been mostly on NESasm simply because that's what the Nerdy Nights tutorials were based on. So I
Yeah.
didn't have anything else to go off of. They
Mhm.
don't have a set of C, and that's also kind of funny. I thought it was called CA65, but you're calling it CC, so I'm kind of confused. But anyway, there's no tutorials on CC or CA, whichever one it is.
Right.
65, so that's why I'm on NESasm.
Yeah. So CA65 is the assembler. The whole package is called CC65 though, because it is the C compiler package for 6502 and a bunch of other
Gotcha.
platforms.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. And okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So picking the assembler was pretty much my number two after, like I said, banks and orgs, which I'm still a little fuzzy on, but I'm getting better. For example, let's take a case scenario, if you want to do that.
Sure.
So with Memory Mapper 0, as I understand it, you get 116K bank of PRG memory and one 8K bank of char or graphics ROM memory. Okay. So what confuses me about that is simply adding those two up is 24K. But from what I'm reading on a lot of the posts and different forums is that 40K is the smallest you can make a game, meaning that's the minimum amount of space you get allocated. So either I don't understand fully banks still, or I'm missing my math. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, so
I may have worded the question a little bit wrong, but
no, that's fine. I'm just trying to think this through. So, I mean, what I assume it's referring to.
Or I could reword it. When I assemble my game, it because I use the minus. I think it's the minus S option. Let me look at my bat file real quick. Yeah, minus S option. So when I assemble my game, it'll run it through the normal 2 passes, and it'll show me bank 0 used / free, bank 1 used / free, and bank 2 used / free. Well, the total just seems a lot shorter than 40K. So I'm just kind of concerned that maybe I'm not utilizing all of the space, or I'm just worried I'm painting myself into a corner so that when the game is getting closer and closer to being done, that I didn't do something right or set something up right with the number of banks or memory being allocated to the program.
Yeah, I'm trying to think where 40K would come from. The only thing I can think of, and then we'll get to a couple of the questions here real quick.
Sure,
because
absolutely.
they're short. The only thing I can think of is some sort of inherent limitation in the hardware itself of the max addressable amount is like a 32K prog chip and 8K of char RAM or ROM. Because I'm pretty sure, and Nathan, if you're still there and you're listening, you feel free to correct me if I've totally messed this up, but I'm pretty sure this is right. I'm pretty sure that the PPU can only ever address 8K of memory. So no matter how many banks you have or any kind of trickery you're doing, at any one time, the PPU will always only have 8K. But I think the CPU can address up to 32K of program ROM, which would add up to that 40K. Now, if you need more than that, like you've got a game like, I think Kirby is 512K. Maybe, I'm pretty sure that's the biggest NES program. It might be bigger than that, but I'm pretty sure it's 512K. So then if you got to go over that 32K size limit on the program ROM, then you have to do bank switching on the program ROM so that you can swap in your code and swap it out. With the other thing you could do for the character memory for your graphics, you could use char RAM, which starts out blank, and then you load your tiles from your regular ROM, right? From the prog ROM, it's just data in there, and you load it into the RAM, and the PPU then has access to it. And then the nice thing about that is you can do things like compression, and you can use banks that you've designated for graphics to kind of offload the organization of all that stuff. I think that's where that 40K limit comes from.
Okay,
that would make sense to me.
I kind of get what you're saying. That does help a little bit. The 40K basically came from a video that I'm sure you've seen, the latest Micro Mages release that came from Morphcat Games, and they did a video on how they squeezed this game into 40K, and so I just assumed, because I asked them which mapper they use, they said memory mapper 0, so I immediately associated 40K as the minimum. But when I look at my code, I was like, wait a minute, I only have 24K, so where am I missing the other 16?
I'm bringing up the calculator here to convert some hex here, but so the address space that's available from the end of the memory map registers all the way up to the end of addressable space FFFF is about 40K, it looks like. So it's a little bit more than that, but there are probably things that are up there that you can't address. So that seems like the answer to me, is that you've got your 32K of code, and then your 8K of graphics, and then so that's your 40K. And if you need anything more than that, you need to use a mapper like MMC3 or whatever mapper you choose, and that's a whole other debate that goes on pretty regularly, it seems.
Gotcha. Okay. You said there were some questions.
Yeah. So Make It Snow 1 was asking 2 questions. One was kind of a statement, but I think it's worth kind of talking about. So the first one was, what languages do you guys program for in your regular jobs outside of the NES? And then also said the question is, learning all these nuances for the NES is the question is that worth it, because it's pretty intense?
I can give you my short spiel on that, but if you want to go first, either way.
No, go ahead.
Well, for me, it was it didn't seem to help. It actually seemed to hinder my Bash and Perl C# kind of background, because I put those methodologies into how to program a NES game. And for example, when you're doing something in C#, for example, you don't have to worry so much about attributes. Is this a sprite? Is it on this name table? Is it a tile? Is it a meta tile? Is it a palette? Is it background? It's just, I want a window and I want a button, and when I click it, it needs to do this. So it seems to be more event driven, and I just could not wrap my head around non-event driven programming, and that was the biggest hurdle. Knowing that this is code that's running every frame, it was something I just could not stop and actually understand. And it wasn't a script that was one and done, and so that was my hurdle, just understanding that.
So I guess then, to the question that was raised, like, this is low level, and it is to some degree intense. Like, there are definitely there were episodes where I was pulling my hair out because I was struggling with getting the attributes to work while scrolling, which is you know, in other programming environments, making some scrolling background isn't that big a deal. On the NES, it is, because of these weird idiosyncratic things that the hardware does, right? So, you know, you're sort of at the beginning stages of learning this and getting things going. And so, what are your feelings on, has it been worth it yet?
Absolutely. I could say when I first got my blank screen, when it actually compiled and I got a blank screen, I flipped out. I did. I got a blank screen. I remember running in and grabbing my wife and saying, "Babe, look, I got a blank screen." She's like, "That's great, honey."
That was more than I got, I think.
Yeah, but was it worth it? Yeah, because I realized it was something that was obtainable. It was feasible. I could actually do this, and going from there, actually, learning colors and how to color sections of the screen and understanding how they were broken up into tiles, and you know, each attribute colors the 2x2, and just really digging into the different you know uh, tiles, meta tiles, and name tables, just understanding it. I finally got a sprite on the screen. You should have seen me when I got a sprite on the screen. I about fell out of the chair. I was like, I got something on the screen, and I looked at my code and I was like, what the heck does this say? I didn't understand. I was like, well, what the LDA $0200? What does that even mean? Like, even after I read it, I was like, okay, I read it, I can understand it, but is it worth it? Yeah, because now I'm doing controllers and learning how to do that, and I can move it, and it's absolutely it. It's kind of what makes the same. It's the same reason that made Mario Maker so successful. And in its simplistic form, Mario Maker is basically a tile editor and compiler, and it makes the game for you in a very simplified GUI format. But it's the joy of being able to create and play. So I would say definitely go for it. It's worth it. I'm a month in. I'm still drowning. I'm not treading water yet, but I still love it.
Yeah, it's so for me, for work, my primary language, well, I jump around a lot because I have a lot of things that I have to work on at any given time, but primarily C# these days. I've been doing some stuff with PowerShell because of work we're doing with Microsoft Azure. So, but before that, I was doing C, C++, Unix programming, and had learned C because I was interested in making games. And I had learned a little bit of assembly because and of course this kind of dates me, but it's no secret. I started learning while DOS was still prevalent and Windows 95 was still considered awful for gaming. And so I started learning, the assembly you needed to know in order to be able to switch video modes on your VGA card and update memory buffers and do double buffering and do all your own 2D rendering. And so I was sort of familiar with it at the time. I was young enough that I was willing to sort of accept that it worked without really fully understanding why. I have a better appreciation and understanding for it now because of just age and also experience. But at the time, I didn't know. I was like, okay, well, yeah, sure. I just do these things and it works. And now I'll make some really crappy game that I don't finish. And I've been doing the NES thing, 2 days a week, basically for the last year and a half now. I calculated what the actual real time comes out to, and I think I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of, if I had been working on this for a month full time, which is kind of cool, but also it's like, oh, it seems so much longer because of how spread out everything is over the episodes and the streams, because I've really been I've really been trying to be good about ensuring that everything is captured, including all of the terrible moments where I just am so stupid and make dumb mistakes and just sit there kind of humming and hawing at what's not working. But I also kind of wanted to do that, obviously not for people who know what they're doing, but for the people who are learning and, you know, will eventually be like, oh, this game, he recorded how he made the whole thing, and then I can go look and see, and then they can see how many episodes I wasted trying to figure out how to make attributes work with scrolling, and then decided that I had to change my meta tiles from 32 by 32 to 16 by 16, and then had to rework all that attribute stuff and just drove myself absolutely crazy. But at the same time, at the end of the day, to put the game ROM file on my EverDrive and put it into my toaster NES and fire it up on a CRT, even though it looks terrible still because I am not an artist, it's just so cool. It's just so, there's just something really satisfying about that, and something, you know, same thing as when I was doing it on the Game Boy Advance, to pop a flash cartridge in and have it power on and show the graphics on that horrible unlit LCD was just such a really cool feeling of accomplishment. And similarly, I showed my wife, you know, various steps, and she's just like, okay. And you're like, you don't understand. I spent so much time making that thing appear and move around on screen, and she's like, that's great, honey.
Yep. Yeah.
So
no, I can definitely relate. And you hit you definitely hit on one of the things I definitely wanted to talk to you about, was the fact that how many episodes have you said, how'd you word it? Basically, how many episodes have I wasted hemming and hawing and debugging one of the issues? And I think that's one of the other, I don't want to say limitations, it's more my personal limitation because of knowledge and experience. But if I have an issue with C# or an issue with, you know, Bash or whatever I'm programming in, it's very easy for me to, you know, exit out of the code and print out variables and to be able to see what it, you know, or put a breakpoint in and, you know, look at the Visual Studio. You just roll over your debug and it'll tell you what values certain constants and variables hold. It doesn't seem to be as intuitive yet to me on how to debug something. So debugging in general seems to be a very big difficulty. It seems to be a lake filled with crocodiles, and I don't know how to cross it. So I get swallowed up every time I step into the water. So
well, so what emulator are you using?
I started with FCE, you know, UX, which seems to be the common one. I think it was your video or someone else's post who told me that Mesen is better for debugging. I switched to Mesen and I cursed at it, closed it out, went back to FCE. I guess I was like, I don't know what I'm looking at, what's going on here. So I went back to FCE, but both of them, for example, let's say I'm doing a controller reading. And I latch the buttons. I'm actually impressed that I can talk about this. And I latch the buttons by sending the 1, then the 0, I think it is, to, what is it, 4016, right?
Yep.
And then you initialize your, let's say, register X. And let's say you want to initialize it to 8 because there's 8 bits. And you want to make a loop to read through all the buttons. I can do that fairly well. And I've gotten several successes, functions on doing read controllers now. I'm happy. But for the longest time, I couldn't figure out, for example, when I did an AND against the byte that I populated with the buttons. I called it buttons 1 for player 1 and buttons 2 for player 2.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure out the result of the AND. And I was trying to verify that the buttons were getting populated. It was. I looked at the hex editor, and it was the 5th byte in my 0-page declaration. So I watched the 5th byte while I was moving the controller around, and it was getting populated. I was like, great. So my next step was to verify the next step, which was the anding, and I wanted to see the values of the and verify, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. I couldn't say, okay, break here and print, dollar something. I don't know. I couldn't figure out how to debug it.
Right. So for something like that, there are a couple of ways that you could do it. So the first is what you had mentioned, where you could watch the memory and the memory view, right? And you just see the memory get updated after you step through your code and do your loop. The other thing that Mesen does, I mean, FCEUX may do it, but I couldn't get it to do it easily. If it does, I don't think it does, but Mesen supports reading the debug generated file from CC65 or CA65, so that when you load up your code in Mesen, it will actually, you can switch over to your code view, not the raw assembler view, and it will also understand your variable names. So what you can do is you can say, okay, well, so to take your example, I've shifted the bit onto, or I've read the controller bit, right? And then I want to and that onto my buttons 1, and I want to see what that actually looks like. You can, just like in Visual Studio, you can set up a watch for those variables. So as you step through, you can just see on the bottom of the debugger there, you can actually see those variables getting updated instead of having to watch it in memory. Now
and that's with Mesen, right?
Yeah, that's with Mesen.
Interesting.
You can't do prints per se in the way that you're describing. But one other thing you can do with both of them is you can do things like you can use the Lua integration, which it's like, wait, first I had to learn assembly and now I've got to learn Lua too. But it's worth it, because you can do things like you can set up Lua code that says, okay, if there's a write to this address, do this thing, right? And then the do this thing could be to update something on the screen.
There does seem to be conditional requirements in FCE's debugger, but I don't know how to, like you said, if something written to this address, like what is the syntax for that in FCE, for example? There doesn't seem to be a lot of documentation on just debugging in general because it seems emulator specific, and I think that's why it's so vacant in existence.
Yeah, in Mesen, I mean, so that's the thing. Sauer, who developed Mesen, he's got a lot of documentation. He supports a ton of features. In fact, Nathan Tolbert, who is on the chat, was saying that the other day, I forget if it was like yesterday or the day before, he's like, I can't tell you the number of times I've asked for Sauer to add something only to find out that it's already there. It's extremely feature complete. It's one of the few developer tools that I've used outside of the community that was written by a single person, and I think it's just a single person that is at the level of quality of a professional product like Visual Studio. Just even simple things like the shortcut keys map to the same shortcut keys in the Visual Studio debugger. So you use F10 to step through. F9.
I think F10's the same as Visual Studio, like you said. Yeah.
Yeah. True. Yeah. And it's changeable too. I think you can even remap every single shortcut key to anything you want, which is, again, something that you don't typically find in projects that are written for things like this. Usually it's just like the bare minimum to get it working. And so while FCEUX is maybe a better performing assembler in that the resource requirements are less, and it tends to run put your system under less load when emulating. The to me, the debugger in Mesen is game changing. It really improved things for me to be able to use Mesen to do debugging. And if you want to do a session of like getting that set up and looking at that, we can definitely do that, because I think it's worth it. It's an excellent emulator, and he actually I don't know what state it's in, because I was in that Discord, and then I had to mute it because there was too much going on in the NES Programming Discord. He a little while back announced that he made Mesen S, which is a Super NES emulator, which will have the same kinds of features as the NES emulator, which once this is done, I want to move on to making a Super NES game. And so it made me feel a whole lot better to have those tools available, because on the Game Boy Advance, when I was working on stuff like that, there was really nothing. Visual Boy Advance was the best emulator I could find to do some debugging, and even that wasn't super great. And so I ended up buying all these weird hardware peripherals that you could hook up to your Game Boy and a parallel port on your PC, and then use a C library so it would output text onto a DOS window on your PC, you know, for printf type statements.
Hardcore debugging, pun intended.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I would definitely be interested in another session in doing a Mesen debugging. That would be huge.
Okay.
I've opened up that thing, and it just, I think he pretty much, and it's just not to degrade, you know, him or the product. I think it's great, but it's kind of like kitchen sink. It's everything. I walk into hardware, you know, Home Depot, and I'm like, I just wanted a nail. There's 30 aisles, and you know, they're each 100 yards long, and I really don't know where to go to find my nail.
Yeah.
So it's just a little overwhelming, and so debugging in general.
Well, and that's the thing. It's like, again, like with the Lua, it's like, okay, I just wanted to write an NES game, and now I have to learn how to use this debugging system too. And I discovered,
I'm trying to avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, I discovered that a lot of people in the NES development community seem to avoid using debuggers, and they have all their own little tricks for, you know, updating things in memory to and whatever else they do to avoid doing it. And it's just like, I don't know how you could not use it. It's like me trying to write C++ code and not having a debugger to step through when I had a bug. It just
well,
but I think
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, but I think it's also part of your background, you know. It's like what your experience is as a programmer. A lot of people in the NES development community, they're coming from no programming in some cases, which that to me is even more nuts. Like, it's like, oh, I've never programmed anything before. Now I'm going to write 6502 for the NES, and I have to learn about all the most difficult hardware limitations. It's
it's definitely different. But I will attribute this, you know, little small pat on the back to myself. I have gone, with the exception of looking at the hex editor to validate my buttons. I did figure it out, by the way. I just kept playing with it, and it eventually worked. I honestly couldn't tell you what fixed it. I can only tell you what I changed.
Mm-hmm.
But I have gotten at least, you know, background sprites, and I can move them around, you know, my little 400 and whatever lines of code without debugging. So it's possible to do at least a Tetris or Dr. Mario or something simple, single screen, I guess. But I would absolutely be thrilled to learn how to debug, and I'm sure other people would as well. So that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to do that. That would go in line with the whole source control thing. I don't know if you caught the discussions with Kevin and Bo about that. now it's kind of become a joke, but you know, the use of any sort of source control besides zipping up your files and
I was gonna say, does zip count?
yeah. So, well, and that's the thing, right? Like, I again, I think it's just what your experience is. Once you work at a company that's of a certain size and they have source control, you realize the benefits of having it. And
Oh, absolutely.
you know, and obviously working by yourself, it's not necessary, but it's kind of a comforting thing to have, to be able to revert back to your code without having to remember to zip it up, you know, all that time.
I'm crazy enough. I actually have separate folders. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try something. Copy folder. And then I go into that folder. I'll edit the file. You know what? That really didn't work. Just delete the folder. And then I go back. But yeah, the advantages of GitHub and, you know, some of the other branches that use source code control are definitely useful. And experientially, I have never had to, oddly enough, even as big as our company is. I'm the sole programmer, you know, with one backup guy. So it's not, there's not a team of, it's not like we're Yahoo or Google or something. And, you know, so.
Right.
Yeah. So, but no branching yet, but I'm sure I'll get there, but right now, not yet.
I mean, it's I feel like as soon as you have more than one person, it becomes useful, but also, like Derek from Gradual Games has pointed out that he's used Git. There's a feature in Git for basically it helping you to pinpoint where the bug was introduced. So you say something like, okay, so at this point in my code it worked, at this point in my code it's broken, and it just keeps kind of alternating where you keep testing it over and over, and then eventually it's like you broke it here, and it points you to the change that was committed that broke the code. And at least based on what he said and what Nathan have said, that works remarkably well at pointing out exactly what commit broke your game, which is kind of amazing.
No, I can definitely see the value in that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Going back real quick to what you said with the Lua, I'm going to give you a gentle nudge reminder.
Yeah.
Really okay, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I gotta get you that.
I checked the description. And I was like, doggone it, he still hasn't uploaded it.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I actually forgot with everything going on. We were.
Oh, no,
I don't remember if you asked for that before we were on vacation or after, but
I'll go ahead and say I did to make you feel worse. But
well, I was going to say it would make me feel better because I was, you know, at least in a different, majorly different time zone. So, you know, my brain got scrambled or something.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. No worries. But I just saw a lot of value in it because I can't tell you if my code, and that's one thing I would like to also do, maybe a session on efficiency code or code review, you know, condensing and I don't know how to exactly word it, but basically making code a lot more efficient, you know, because there's only so many cycles we have. There's only so much CPU power the NES has.
Right.
And that VBlank comes up real quick, which is kind of a funny thought. How does VBlank even apply in a non-CRT world?
Well, you're still rendering at a certain frame rate. So
That's internal, the CPU.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it think about it this way, like the CPU can run and do things faster than the screen can render. So what you're doing in a game that's being emulated is, you know, the CPU runs your code, then once the frame is drawn, and I don't know how an emulator does it, if it's as meticulous as actually trying to draw it line by line, or if it composites it and then simulates the amount of time that it takes to draw the screen and then invokes the interrupt. But the point is that there is a natural amount of time between frames, even if you're running at something like 60 or 120 frames per second, if your code is running well, or you're not doing a lot in between frames, there is this sort of time period where you've got code is done running, graphics have drawn, and now kind of nothing is happening. Because you can't do, you might want to, you might, I think I've heard that some games will, run cycles ahead of, like maybe 1 or 2 cycles ahead of where the screen is drawing. But basically it's like you've calculated everything you need to draw the next frame, but it's not time to draw the next frame yet. So you've got to wait, and then you draw the next frame. And that's what NMI is. NMI is the time between the screen has drawn, but it's not time to start drawing the screen again from the top to the bottom.
Does the CPU go into a no-op or hold, or what is it doing?
It depends. Like that's why in the Nerdy Night tutorials, it puts the CPU into an infinite loop after initialization, and then it does all that stuff in NMI, because otherwise, once you came out of the NMI, it would jump back to whatever code was running outside of it, and if you didn't put that infinite loop in, it would just continue running into random memory essentially, and interpreting those as operations even though they're garbage.
Gotcha. Okay. I kind of wondered about that because I didn't quite understand, but yeah, no, that sheds a little light on it. I appreciate that.
It's weird. I mean, some of these concepts are like you said, it's like, how does that apply without an electron gun on the screen that I'm drawing on? But it's still, if you're running at 60 frames per second, that's what, a 15 millisecond interval between frames. You can do a lot of code in 15 milliseconds if you're not doing a lot of work, or you're efficient with what you're doing. So there may be a point at which it takes 5 milliseconds to run your code, but you've got 10 more milliseconds before the screen draws. The problem where you run into problems is it takes you 25 milliseconds to do your work, and you've already now lost a frame, right? And worst case scenario, you re-rendered the frame before. So you re-rendered it, and now it looks like the frame rate has dropped.
Right.
Or so you get stutter in your game. Best case scenario, that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that your memory is being updated at the time, and so you get this weird intermediate state of some things are moved, some things aren't, some things have been updated, your background is partially updated. There's all sorts of stuff that could go wrong there.
Makes sense.
And so that was, I think, related to, I had commented to you about not trying to do everything in NMI. I think that was you, right?
I believe so.
Yeah. So, and that was one of the other things that I feel like it doesn't really touch on in Nerdy Nights. And I realize it's it's a beginning tutorial. It's meant to kind of help people get started, but
it was one of your second videos too, though, moving your code out of VBlank, which I thought was hilarious when you broke it. I couldn't stop laughing. I was like, yes, someone else that's struggling. A guy who knows a lot more than me, and he's gotten probably 10 minutes of head scratching going on here. This makes me feel good.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that when I got started doing all of this, I was only maybe slightly more knowledgeable than what I was trying to do at the time on the video. So I quoted the Mythbusters when I started this, I believe, and I'll requote them, but it's collective ignorance, and we're sitting there, we're sitting learning together, and there are going to be times, the Mythbusters have the benefit of being limited to whatever it was, 22 minutes or 52 minutes, and having an editing staff. So unfortunately for everybody else that's watching these videos, they go on forever, however long they go, and and you just get the whole thing.
Right. I did want to touch on one other thing. You kind of reminded me of something when we were laughing about your debugging debacle.
Mm-hmm.
And just when I was talking about debugging in general, you know, and definitely want to do the Mesen or FCE UX, either one debugging session. But that's one of the other things I wanted to go back to. I forgot the name of the gentleman who had left the question, but in regards to some of the difficulties, one of the things that you have to be aware of when it comes to programming for the NES is support. When you have a question or a problem, for example, if I'm trying to make a C# application, a Windows Form application, and I want to say, you know, I want to make this button click, open up Internet Explorer and go to Google. I can type that into Google and get an example in a few seconds. You know, I can't Google how do I make Mario shoot fireballs backwards. You just can't. It's hard to, because when you're new, you don't understand the verbiage. So a lot of the terminology is off. You first have to know that what you're talking about is a sprite. You have to know that it's, you know, that sprite exists as a tile or a meta tile, and that tile exists on a name table, and that name table is called, and it has a palette. And so just understand that there's a huge gap between the support you're going to get. It's not as fast, it's not as available. Just understanding how to ask the question is very difficult. And I think that's my biggest hurdle right now. I know what I'm trying to do, but I don't know how to search for an answer because I don't know exactly what I need to do to get the answer. I just know what I want that tile to do.
Right. And so, I mean, you do. Yeah, I agree. It's much easier to search for modern, sort of more relevant things. But you know, I think Nintendo Age's forums in the brewery section, certainly the Discord, are pretty friendly places to ask for help. Especially when you're trying to describe what you're doing in a pretty technical way, but maybe using the wrong terminology because you don't know what the right terminology is.
Half the time my questions get laughed at. I'm like, well, sorry, that's all I can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the NESDev forums, you'd run into more, at least based on from what I've heard, you'd run into more situations of people arguing with you on terminology.
Then helping, yeah.
Yeah. Or yeah, I mean, and again, that's not to disparage anybody from going to NESDev because it's an amazing resource, and definitely people there are very helpful once you get past that stuff. But I've just heard some negative things about the I don't even want to say the attitude because it's not really an attitude, but the challenges of posting questions there versus Nintendo Age, where people are, I think, a little bit more understanding and
Yeah, I think it's just a difference of the members, meaning NESDev, you just have to know who you're talking to. NESDev is more of the pure technical, I guess, geniuses.
Yeah.
They know every reason why this bit is turned on and, you know, where it is on the circuit board level kind of information, while Nintendo Age is more of the me, you, average Joe. I want to get my own version of Galaga. How do I, you know, make this ship move? And oh well, first of all, that's a sprite, and you need to make it move through latching your controllers, etc., etc. So,
yeah. Make It Snow, who had asked some of the other questions, also asked, could maybe hacking a ROM be just as fun as trying to write from scratch?
I'll let you take that one first.
I mean, my personal thoughts on that is I think people, except for the most simplistic ROM hacks where it's just, you know, graphics being replaced, which is relatively straightforward. I think ROM hacking in its real form, people don't necessarily understand the complexity of what that means, because and I'm not trying to imply that to you, Make It Snow. I'm saying in general, people kind of dismiss ROM hacks as being somehow less technically challenging or less homebrew-ish, which to some extent they are, and we can talk about the reasons why, and they've been argued a million times. But basically, ROM hacking is, to my mind, very difficult, because what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to take this body of code that's been written in 6502, and it might be more than 40K worth of assembly code. It could be a huge amount of assembly code. And I'm going to read the assembly with no variable names, no label names, no comments. I'm just going to step through and I'm going to read the code and try and figure out what's going on so that I can then change that code to do what I want it to do. And to me, like, I have enough of a hard time reading my code that I wrote 3 weeks ago and being like, what was I thinking? Which is why a lot of times I'll go back, and once I decipher what my intent was, because I totally forgot, I'll add comments that explain it again, because I know I'm going to go back and be like, what was I thinking? And so I think ROM hacking, people think it sounds easy. And again, for changing the graphics or a game where it's been really well documented what you hack to change it, that's fine. But for any other, for anything else, I feel like you're talking about more work than writing your own thing.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with all of that. It does seem that the ROM hacks are somewhat, I wouldn't say frowned upon, but they are kind of like, well, you didn't do any of the work. You just kind of modified someone else's.
Right.
Now, on the flip side of that, is it enjoyable and is it fun? Sure. I mean, seeing the Contra guy run across Mario World is probably hilarious, or seeing, I saw one hack a guy had, I think it was the Excite Bike character running around on the double dribble field, So it's just, it can be fun, and it can also be something new without having to know and start from scratch and understand that you need a reset and a clear and a bank and an org, and it does narrow your search. You're only searching for X. You don't have to understand A through Z. So to kind of give you the flip side of the coin, everything Mike said is true, but it can be a little bit of more fun in the fact that you get, I would say, faster results because the game's complete.
Yeah, that's true. It's like working in an engine versus, I mean, it's a more technically sophisticated engine to some extent, because it wasn't designed to be an engine. It just happens to be one that you're gonna usurp.
Right.
But yeah, so then you go in and you modify this location in memory, and it's like, oh, Mario runs way faster now. That's cool. What can we do with that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it spawned from the fact that most of us, when we grew up, either had or knew someone who had a Game Genie. Like, you know what, that would be kind of fun. I want to hack this game and make it so that I can run through walls and jump higher. And is it possible to jump over the flag? And sure, let's make it happen. And so there's that enjoyment factor.
Yeah, and the Game Genie codes are kind of their own beast. There's I wish that I remembered the name of the person who does this, but there's at least one individual that I've heard of who now makes new Game Genie codes for homebrew games.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's like on a whole nother level, because not only do they have to understand how games work on the NES, they have to understand how the Game Genie works, and then have to figure out for the individual homebrew games how they write a code that makes the homebrew do something different. which is just totally wild to me. Like that's pretty amazing and really, really cool.
That is really cool. I've not heard of that until now. That's actually very cool, and what an accomplishment to be able to not only be able to edit, like you said, regular Nintendo games, but homebrew games. Because part of the discussion I found in Nintendo Age and some of the other members is no one can seem to agree that how you and I and they and everybody is doing it with NESASM and CC65 and banks and orgs and etc. Are we doing it the same way that Nintendo did it? And no one can actually seem to give me a definitive answer. So we don't even know if we're doing it the same way. So to him
Yeah.
to reverse engineer how to do game genies for both homebrew and Nintendo, that's wow. That's a lot more time than I have.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I was super impressed to hear about that, and it's kind of fun to see what games actually get those codes. The one in particular that I'm thinking of is there were some codes created for Lizard.
I saw that game. Yeah, Lizard.
Yeah, that's a good one. And that's the other thing about all of this is like the amount of love and dedication that go into making these games is really incredible. And so it's not like, I mean, it's not like anybody's doing this to get rich quick, right?
No.
You know, I mean, I think there are surprise hits like Micro Mages, you know, where they've just raised obscene amounts of money. Well deserved.
Yeah, absolutely. They use CC65, by the way, so just letting you know. I asked Julius, he was the programmer, and Nicholas was the artist. And surprised they actually responded to me because I know how busy they are. And,
yeah.
I was like, hey, just out of curiosity, what assembler do you use and why? Asked them the same question. And CC65, why? Because we like it. And I was like, oh, great. Another vague answer. That's great. It doesn't help. So,
yeah.
But yeah, that was just interesting. But definitely not doing it to get rich. This is all for fun. So yeah, back to Snow. Was it Snowmaker? Snow.
Make it snow.
Make it snow. Okay, make it
Yeah.
snow. ROM hacking. If it's what you love, I say go for it. You're part of the community. You know, why not? You know.
Yeah, and certainly even just to get started, kind of looking at the code and understanding it it's definitely useful. It'll improve your debugging skills.
Absolutely. Definitely would say go for it though. Yeah, that's pretty cool though. Homebrew. I'm still tripping over the Game Genie. I was like, are you serious? There's a Game Genie for homebrew? That's insane. Like, will it work on mine? Mine's coded with 1 month of knowledge.
I'm sure it will.
Yeah, so I don't even know where that would go in. But yeah, this has been awesome. I got lots of probably additional technical questions we could probably go into with my actual code, but we could probably save that for another time as we've kind of gone for a while, maybe more than you expected. But or we can keep going. It's up to you.
I'm happy. Excuse me. I'm happy to wrap now if you want. We can we can do this again, and we don't have to necessarily live stream every single one. But it would be cool to do it for things like the debugger. I think people would definitely get something out of that because I know how scary that can be. So
yes, that would be awesome. I don't have 1,000 yet, so I can't tell all my 902 subscribers about it. But if I get 98 more, I could tell them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're almost there. So hopefully, I mean, here's the thing, right? Like you started your channel, talking about retro games and reviewing retro products and stuff like that.
Right.
And I started my channel basically as is right now, just like putting out these videos and trying to do it regularly so that people whatever knowledge I can impart on them as much as possible. When I started this, if you had told me, oh, by the way, you'll have 1,100
followers
on subscribers on YouTube, I would have said, yeah, okay, yeah. Go back to taking whatever drugs you're taking, because there's no way that that's going to happen. But it just kind of speaks to how many people love the NES and at least want to kind of understand it a little bit better, which is really cool. Just so exciting, because it definitely, it has a soft spot, and I'm sure your heart as well. But it's
yes.
like it's why I learned programming. To be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I've wanted to know how assembly worked and how the Nintendo worked, and so when the option came to take, I think it was in middle school, they didn't offer assembly, but they offered basic. So they're like, I'll take that. That's the closest I can get to it. So I'll take basic, and then went into second and third generation languages from there. But yeah, it's the community has been great. Funny enough, on Nintendo Age, I would definitely like to give a shout out to Kevin. That guy, oh my gosh. It was his birthday like 3 days ago, and he took the time to answer my question, and not just answer it. He posted 50 lines of code. He said, well, this is how you do it. Blah. I'm like, oh my gosh. I was just curious if you would have a recommendation on, the path I should take. He didn't give me a path. He gave me a map and a flashlight and a pair of shoes, and pointed to the trail. And so there you go.
Well, yeah, and that's the really nice thing I think about the Nintendo Age community, is that there's definitely this sort of pay it forward mentality. It's like you said, it's not just point me in the right direction. It's like, well, here, let's go together. I'll give you some help to get there, and then from there you should be okay. So it's and there are a lot of people who are on it for a variety of reasons, but on the programming side, it's sort of the same regular bunch of people, and I think without question they all are super just super helpful, and I think that comes from the fact that the people that they asked the questions to were also super helpful, and so it kind of established this really great precedent for helping people out, which is really nice.
Yeah, it's definitely driving me to want to learn, because I want to be, like Kevin or Bunny Boy, and when a question is posted, I can just smile and say, "Oh my gosh, I was there. This is how you do it, buddy. Okay, this is where you went wrong. Okay, no big deal. I've been there, done that. Here's the color of my T-shirt, and let's get you through this." Okay. But the pay it forward, I can't wait, and that's the exciting part for me. The original question, is it worth it? Absolutely. The amount of joy I get, and the amount of joy I get knowing that I can help someone in the future, is what's driving me. Not just making the game, but helping others make games is also the biggest part of the community that I just love.
Yeah, no, it's cool. It's a lot of fun. So, all right, well, why don't we wrap? Make It Snow just left, so thanks for tuning in. And we've got a number of people here on the stream. It looks like about 6 people in the chat. But yeah, so thanks for taking the time, Jonathan, for chatting with me. And as I know, it's a little challenging with the time zone difference.
Not for me.
Well, yeah. But are you on NESDev and Nintendo Age? Nathan's asking.
I am on Nintendo Age as Oleschool, just like the channel. Oleschool. So
OLESCHOOL. Cool.
Yes.
And then
you can laugh at my questions.
You can join the Discord and then waste time like we do during the day talking about arguing about esoteric NES related things or gaming related things.
Actually, I wanted to hit you on that. What is the Nintendo Age Discord? I clicked on it and it just sent me to a server not found. So I don't know if the link is broken or what the Discord channel is. So, do you have it?
I do have it. I'll share it with you. I'll also post it on the description of this video,
Okay.
so that
Along with the Lua script.
yeah, right, with the list. So the what script? Wait, what? Yeah, yes, I will dig that up and get that for you, because
Just a gentle nudge.
yeah, I'm sorry. And Nathan's like, no laughing here. I do my share of stupid stuff.
Oh, good. The joy of the crowd.
We have a good laugh at when we do dumb things. We had this one exchange where everybody was posting their favorite broken version of the game that they were working on at that time.
Oh my gosh. Are
yeah,
you serious?
Some of them were pretty funny. I mean, it was only, it was like 3 or 4 ROMs that were posted, but they were pretty funny, because they were, just all sorts of broken in some cases. And
wow. I got plenty of those.
yeah, I've got everybody watching me do that. So I can't even have an arrogant attitude, because people would just point to, like, well, look at that, at minute 38 and 52 seconds, you didn't know how to divide by 7. It's like,
well, I've actually taken the coward way out. You're definitely more courageous than me. My videos are about 10 to 15 minutes, and it's only after I've got it working, then I explain what's working and how I did it. Just like the controller piece, I haven't made the video because I'm not going to post it until I get it working. So now it's ready. So I'm going to work on it this weekend and probably post it next week. And then
cool.
It'll be a short 10, 15 minutes. It's not going to be, there's no laughing at me.
Oh, I have no ego anymore. I've learned that there's no place for that in programming. So at least in any place that I want to work. So
yeah. I don't know. I'm not there yet, but I'm learning.
All right. Well, cool. Thanks again for joining us, and for everybody watching the video afterwards. If you didn't catch it, Jonathon's got a channel on YouTube called Oleschool Gamers. You should definitely check it out. I'm going to post the link on the description in the video also for that again, so you can check out his content. And yeah, once again, thanks for chatting today, and it was a lot of fun. I hope we do this again. We'll do the debugging session and just see where your game's at.
Absolutely. I can't wait. I'm looking forward to that.
Cool.
Thanks again for having me.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Take care.
All right.
See ya.
See ya.
And bye, everybody on the chat.